Here at Charlie Crimebuster, we welcome comments, suggestions, opinions, and whether you agree or disagree with our view on a topic, we still want to hear from you. Reach out with a shout-out. Email Charlie at charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Or you can call or text us at 407-917-2211. That's 407-917-2211. And we'd like to thank our sponsor, PeacemakerNetwork.com, and also thank those of you who already support our podcast. Did you know that your donations not only help with this podcast, but also support the brave men and women, first responders, law enforcement, correction officers, security personnel, and our military? You too can donate, as well as become a monthly badge member. That's BADGE member by simply subscribing to PeacemakerNetwork.com. That's PeacemakerNetwork.com. And if you're a true crime junkie, we would like to encourage you to binge-cast by listening to our podcasts located on many of the popular podcast platforms. Simply search for Charlie Crimebuster, or you can ask your smart speaker to play Charlie Crimebuster. But since you're streaming us here on YouTube tonight, simply click on the subscribe button and you'll be notified each time we drop a new episode. So please do us that huge favor and press that subscribe button right now. And we thank you.
Well, we're talking about the Karen Read murder retrial, and boy, do we have some news tonight. We're going to get you caught up on the last podcast where we talked about that bombshell witness, and we're going to tell you some really interesting stuff about what has happened in the past 2 weeks in the trial. So thank you for joining us. James, tell the folks how they can find us out there on the internet super slab.
Super slab. All right. I love it. All right. Well, thank you, Charlie. Well, we want to remind our listeners that the views and opinions that are expressed here in this presentation are solely those of the individuals interviewed or participating and do not represent those of Charlie Crimebuster nor Peacemaker Network or law enforcement agencies. All individuals described or mentioned in this presentation should be considered innocent unless or until found guilty in a court of law. And the following presentation is for mature audiences. Listener and viewer discretion is advised. And all of our music and sound effects in our show are provided by our friends and contributors to Pixabay.com. They're the ones that are responsible for making our podcast more enjoyable and excitable. That's Pixabay.com. And if you're a true crime junkie, we would like to encourage you to binge-cast. That's our little coined phrase we're using, binge-cast, by listening to our podcast located on many popular podcast platforms. Simply search for Charlie Crimebuster, or you can say to your smart speaker, play Charlie Crimebuster. Regardless of your podcast preference, and you have enjoyed our show, please hit the subscribe button or even the like button. We'd really appreciate that. And finally, here at Charlie Crimebuster, we welcome comments, suggestions, opinions, and whether you agree or even disagree with any view on one of our topics, we still want to hear from you. So reach out with a shout-out. Email Charlie at charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Or you can call us or text us at 407-917-2211. That's 407-917-2211.
I'll tell you, James, you talk about a bombshell witness we're talking about with this last podcast. There's been a bombshell announcement. This has already, we're already tomorrow into closing arguments.
Right.
As we're recording this tonight, we're in closing arguments tomorrow. And it's going to have, then after that, I think they can each go an hour and 15 minutes. Then after that, the judge is going to let them go for lunch. And then they're going to come back. She's going to give them about an hour's of instructions. And probably about 2 or 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, the jury will be deliberating on this case.
Wow.
I had no idea it would go that quickly.
I didn't either. Wow.
And I think the surprise, was that Brennan had already gotten permission to use rebuttal witnesses against the experts of the defense.
Mm-hmm.
And he decided not to.
Yeah.
So that's just incredible.
Well, it's definitely a title. You titled it right, especially for this week. It's the Battle of the Experts. So,
no doubt about that.
Yeah. So, however you said it, it's not really up to the experts. So, what do you mean when you say it's not up to the experts to make this decision on what happened?
Well, it is the battle of the experts. I mean, a lot of people have been saying that. And there have been a lot of experts in this case on both sides, the defense and the prosecution. But the thing that I think that we have to understand, that it's important to understand, is that it's really not up to the experts. It's really up to how the jury views the experts. And
Hmm.
when you
Hmm.
have two different experts on each side who are seeing two different things, then it has to be how the jury, how those experts come across to the jury. So ultimately, it's the jury. You know, you can have the greatest expert in the world, and if that expert is not believable, or if that expert, sometimes if that expert just isn't liked by the jury, it could sway them the other way. So when we say battle of the experts, there's a lot of experts there that are battling, but the people that make the decision is not, are the people that will make the decisions will not be the experts. It's going to be that jury. So it's so important, I think, not only, and I think maybe we should point this out, not only how the expert comes around to the jury, but also how the attorneys themselves appear
Yeah.
before the jury, and
Yeah.
whether they have respect or trust in that way. And I think we've seen a big swing this week that we will be talking about, in the next podcast as we talk about what's coming up. Next week we're going to be talking about. We've had to kind of switch things around a little bit because I did not think that we would get there that quick.
Right.
So this Sunday's podcast, if we don't have a verdict, think about this, James. It's going to the jury tomorrow afternoon, and she wants them to deliberate. They're going to have 3 hours to deliberate. So the jury could, in fact, go in there and come out with a verdict by 5 o'clock that afternoon or 6 o'clock that afternoon.
Wow.
Now they'll not be deliberating over the weekend, but they will deliberate that afternoon. I don't expect it to be that quick. If it does come back that quick, I can just about guarantee you it will be not guilty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I don't think that they'll come back that quick for guilty. I know they won't come back that quick if it's a hung jury. So if they do come back quick, it would be not guilty. But then, if they don't come to a conclusion, they're not going to deliberate over the weekend. It's going to go into next week. So we're planning on, according to what the jury does, in our next podcast, we're going to be talking about evidence that demands a verdict. We're just going to go over the evidence so that people can be thinking about what the jury is going over. But getting
Gotcha.
back to this past week, the experts have been there, and they have been talking. And as I said, it's not the expert that's going to make the decisions how the jury views the expert.
Right. Well, and speaking of experts, you mentioned in the podcast that the experts were paid. Now, how is that going to have an impact on the jury?
Well, yes, and I was a little surprised because, and now this is what's come out through the trial, but who knows what the bottom line will be when they get done. It could be that some of the experts haven't sent the final bill in, But at this point, it's been pretty well estimated that the defense, that the prosecution has paid our arbiter. They've paid them around, get this, $400,000,
Good
whereas
Lord.
the defense is only paid around $50,000. And I don't know about you, James, but I sure think that the defense got more bang for their buck
Yeah,
than the prosecution did.
definitely. Definitely. Wow. Wow.
And I don't think, let me ask you how you think about it. I don't think that the jury is going to be swayed one way or the other about how much they paid each one, because I think people pretty well expect today that you pay big money for these kind of things, and you expect people to get paid. So I just kind of, I don't really think that they're going to that's going to have a lot of sway on people. They know that these experts are paid. I don't think it's going to sway the jury one way or the other how much either paid for either. What do you think?
Um, you know, I think maybe finances have a lot to do with it because, you usually want to pay more to get more bang for your buck. And I don't know if they come across that way. I know the expert for the prosecution was very strong, even in cross.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't seem to be get rattled at all. But but then again, Arca, when they came, same thing. He wasn't rattled either.
Yep.
So
Right. Yep.
both of them are very professional men. Did a very good job explaining each of their individual studies. So yeah, I think it's. But I think, based upon what you pay, um, it may sway the jury because they're trying to spend more. That's taxpayer money.
Yeah, yeah,
So you have
sure,
to
yeah.
you have to think about that. It's like, well, that's
Mm-hmm.
not really a wise, choice of. And if I'm defending myself, I certainly wouldn't have to spend no $400,000 for an expert.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'd want to get
Yeah,
a better bang for my buck, and I think the
yeah.
defense did a good job.
Yeah, it really just boils down to the jury, doesn't it? Each person, what they think about those things.
Yeah, yeah, it's going to be, but that's why we have juries. So
Yeah, and certainly, it's not evidence, but it is something interesting to think about.
it is, and it's a
Hmm.
factor.
Hmm.
Some
Sure.
people put more weight on that depending if they're a
Yeah,
finance person.
yeah.
They'll look at it that basically the way I outlined. So we'll see. Back to our the defense introducing the proctor's text messages in the trial. How was it done this time?
Well, it's really interesting. They came in earlier, of course. By it was kind of a crazy situation. First of all, if you're listening and you've not been following the trial, the former lead investigator sent some text to a group of friends that was just really terrible. They were very, very degrading of the defendant, and it was very biased upon the part of the lead investigator. And you're not supposed to be biased in these investigations. He said some very terrible things, even that he wished that Karen Read would kill herself,
Right.
and it really put him in a very, 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 very bad image in front of everybody. And so everybody's been wondering about this, but interesting enough, Jackson actually used one of the prosecution's witness to read through some of those texts. And then it turns around, even doing that though, the defense had not yet entered that into the trial as far as their direct evidence. So you have to you got to make sure that when you're doing the closing, that you can only close on evidence that's been introduced to the trial. So then the defense needed to enter that into evidence, and instead of calling Proctor, they actually called another person on that text chain, and it was kind of
Wow.
amazing because
Smart
uh,
move.
yeah, yeah. So, but then on top of that, what was so crazy about it is once they had that person on the stand, and they were going to introduce those texts and said, "Did you get the text?" This sort of thing. Well, then it turned around that Brendan decided to do one of the tricks of the defense, and he had the guy begin to read the text. But then the guy who was reading the text, he got so embarrassed by some of the language and how lewd the text was. He said, "I don't feel comfortable reading them." And so Brennan ended up reading the text and asking the guy, "Did he get the text?" So it's really crazy how those texts got entered. But I will tell you this: the texts, I don't believe, had the impact on this trial that they had the first trial, because
Right.
the first trial you had Proctor up there and he
Yep.
you know he was caught, he was embarrassed, and
Right.
I mean Alan Jackson literally destroyed him on the stands,
Yep. He did.
and neither of them called Proctor during this trial, which was really kind of interesting.
It is
And
interesting.
but I think it does have to do with strategy.
Hmm.
I think the defense right now basically is they're really zeroing in on the reconstruction, and they're zeroing in now on the fact, and we always, as you know, we always tell some stuff that's happening this week
Right.
in addition to it, but the strategy of the defense appears to be, hey, we think we proved that there was no collision. There
Right.
was no hit. And if there was no hit, then she is not guilty. And
Correct.
rather than, they're not even going to argue the third party this time. Even though they were set up to do it, not going to argue that somebody else did it. They're just arguing the fact that there is no proof that she hit him with her car.
Right.
And I don't know. I think it's probably a pretty good strategy, because really that's the whole part of this case. Did she or did she not hit him with the car? So I think they're making it simpler. I think they're a lot stronger. And I don't think the text has that much to do with it, but I do believe that the text at least introduced in the minds of the jury that something is not right about this investigation.
Yeah, right. Well, tell us about the surprise witness police officer.
Well, yeah, I was a little surprised with this. There was a lady that was actually called Kathy Deaver. She was a Canton Police Department officer
Hmm.
when this event happened. But since then, she has now been employed by the Boston Police Department. And
Hmm.
so I was a little surprised to see somebody like this called to the stand. And apparently, the reason Jackson called her is that when the FBI, as you and I know, and probably most of the people listening to this podcast, that there was another agency that was brought into this investigation, and they were brought into the investigation to investigate the investigation.
Right.
Now, the jury doesn't know that, but it's been inferred to. They don't know that it was FBI, and I don't know if they put it together or not. But we know today that that's what it was. So when the FBI was questioning this police officer, who was with the Canton, Kathy Deaver, who was with the Canton Police Department, she reported in August of 2022. She said that she saw that day she was called back to the police department to help a dispatch, and she noticed that Brian Higgins, who was the ATF officer who was in that house where the defense is alleged that John O'Keefe was basically beat up in a fight, and that's how he hit his head, and that's how he lost his life. So
Hmm.
Brian Higgins would have been one of those people. But she said that she saw Brian Higgins and the chief of police spending a wildly amount of time alone with the SUV there in the Sally Port of the Canton Police Department.
Mm.
Now, that they're alleging, the defense is that somebody planted those taillight pieces on the lawn. And so, that gave some kind of idea that maybe that was something nefarious going along there. However, after that, she recanted it. She said, no, no, she said she was mistaken, that she got the timeline wrong. So Jackson wanted to at least introduce that into the record that she had said that. And there was also the inference that before she was called to testify, the commissioner of the Boston Police Department had her come into his office. Now, Boston Police Department is a large police department,
Oh yeah.
and how often does a commissioner call a police officer into the office just before they're going to testify in a trial?
Right.
And so he was trying to, suggest this kind of idea that all the police department stands behind the blue wall,
Yep.
and probably this commissioner said, "Now you need to get in and change your testimony." I don't believe that, because the commissioner's he's smarter than that. He wouldn't do anything. I think he was just encouraging her to get up and tell the truth. So
Right.
whether she saw them with that car or not, I do believe that she probably saw them together, talking together for a long amount of time. But at the same time, James, think about this. I mean, his office was in the Canton Police Department. So
Mm.
is it really irregular that he would be sitting around talking to his chief?
Right. Right.
Now he's not the chief of Higgins, because Higgins is ATF, but a lot of local police departments will allow the ATF officers, agents, to have offices in their complex. So, but so that was the police officer that they called, one of two, by the way, that they called. The defense did in their time.
What was it that she disclosed anyway? What was it that she saw?
Well, basically, she just said that Brian Higgins and the chief of police, she saw them standing there around the SUV by themselves alone, and that could be kind of suspicious. Why would they be standing there behind, right next to that tail light, uh, given the idea that maybe they were tampering with that tail light?
Did she see the taillight at all?
Well, now she says she didn't even see the car. But
Mm.
she said during the first time with the FBI, she said she saw them there with the vehicle. Now she says that she got the timeline wrong. She made a mistake, and
Mm.
I guess it just puts another layer to some suspicion about the investigators in this whole case.
Right.
You
Right.
know that
Yep.
they've just made so many mistakes, in that area.
Wow. Well, I know we share a little news stuff that's happening, especially like this week. What do you have for us tonight?
Well, one of the things is, and this really, you actually just teed up the ball and threw it so I could hit it out of the park. Uh, it brings us to the next thing. That one of the new things was that they did rule when they were going on instructions to the jury that they can do what they call the Bowman thing, where basically that says that the defense can argue about the ineffective investigation.
Oh,
That you can actually say this case was run from the very beginning. The red
right.
solo cups, the snowblower for all that. So there is, I mean, uh, you do have to get permission to argue that to in your closing, and they got permission to really go in, and I can assure you that he's going to have plenty of evidence. And don't you think? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
you think about how terrible this was investigated, and that just really is one of the reasons why we're having the retrial of the century, because it wasn't investigated correctly in the first place. If it had
Right.
been investigated correctly in the first place, Karen Read would either be not guilty or guilty, no doubt about it. We wouldn't have the hung trial and all this confusion about it.
Exactly. Exactly. So there were actually during this trial, there were two attempts to get a mistrial with prejudice.
Yep, yep, two of them, and that's
Yeah.
pretty one. The first one, of course, was when the DNA had not been introduced by the prosecution
Right.
before the prosecution rested their case.
Right.
And the DNA had not been mentioned. And then Hank Brennan comes through there and he begins to introduce DNA into it,
Right.
which, and the DNA was about basically the bites. The prosecution is saying that those injuries on the arm are dog bites.
Right.
And Brennan was going to, to put into the trial the way he did, which was an incorrect way and was in violation of the court rules. Basically, that there was no DNA found, around the shirt or no dog DNA found. We do know there was pig DNA found, but there
Interesting.
wasn't dog DNA. Of course, if somebody says, so when you say pig DNA, I know my dog used to love those pig ears you would get
Yep.
for to feed him, from the
Yep.
pet store, So somebody could have said something on that, but I mean, he said, that this was he thought that this was something that would bring a mistrial, and that mistrial would be with prejudice. Now, with
Hmm.
prejudice, then that means if it was a mistrial, they couldn't try her again. Like, remember the Baldwin case that we talked about.
Right. Right.
The second one was even worse. The second one was the fact that he got up there, and you and I were talking about this again. He gets up, takes the hoodie, and brings it, to one of the experts from the prosecution, actually Crash Daddy, you know,
Oh,
and
okay. Okay.
and basically, shows the picture of the back of that hoodie there, and there's all these cuts in it,
Right.
and it really looks a lot like what happened in the tests that Archive was doing, where there are all these cuts from road rage, on the dummy.
Right.
And so he said, well, look here on the back of this, on the back of his, there's the same kind of cuts there. So he must have been hit by the car. And I thought that Crash Daddy, that Wolf handled it beautifully. He said, no, he said, so those kind of cuts are not are not in comparison to road rage cuts. There's no way that those cuts. But it did. You could see that Wolf was a little surprised to see those cuts. So that was he did. But guess what, James? The cuts was actually caused by a criminalist who was cutting out some of the fabric to test it. So it was. I thought it was one of the most flagrant violations that I've ever seen in a trial. That he actually was deceptive in bringing that to the witness and to the jury, that alleging that those cuts was made by him being hit by the vehicle, when in all reality it was cuts that his own criminalist had done in examining the evidence.
Wow.
And I was thinking when they were arguing this that there was really going to be a possibility that there could be a mistrial with prejudice.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because I mean that is just I got to tell you that prior to this week, I thought, Brennan on his prosecution case, he did I think a lot better than the first case.
Right.
But I think this week he just really tanked it for some reason. I mean, some of the things that he did, he really come across as what a lot of people think about all lawyers, that he's a sleazy lawyer,
Uh, He was
because
desperate. He's
that's just
desperate.
so deceptive, so deceptive, with it. I think you're right. The desperate, is
Yeah.
he wants to
He's fishing.
win
Yeah.
any other way he can. Now,
Yeah.
I mean, was he deceived? Did he really think that those holes had been caused that way himself? Or did he know that all the way from the beginning, just try to slip it in? That's the way it looked,
I think he
you
was
know?
trying to impress the jury.
Yeah, and the jury, of course, then what the judge did, the judge ruled no, said not, I'm not going to grant a mistrial. Rarely do they ever do. And by the way, I don't know if a lot of people know or not, but when you do go for a mistrial, if there's any doubt or anything like that, according to the rules of the law, the judge will give the prosecution the benefit of the doubt. So it has to be something really, really that's not, it has to be really acute for something like that to happen, like what happened in Baldwin. What happened in Baldwin is that they hid evidence
Right.
from the defense. Rarely do they ever get a mistrial over evidence being misquoted, but they do give it sometimes when it's mishandled. But nonetheless, there was two tries for a mistrial, uh, and even though I think that probably the defense knew they would not get a mistrial, guess what? That really does help them set up for an appeal in case Karen Read is found guilty. There's certainly going to be a real case for appeal in
Oh,
this
definitely.
case. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, they've set the ground for and a foundation for going for a an appeal for certainly. Yeah, for certain. Okay, well, let's take a real short break here and tell us about the crazy crook of the week.
James, if you're driving and you've had a little too much to drink, the first moral of the story is do not drive and drink, right?
That's the first
But
rule.
if
Yeah.
you are driving and you're drinking, it would probably not be a good idea driving down the road and see a police officer with another traffic stop and decide to just pull up behind the police car and stop. And that's exactly what this crazy crook did in Pontiac, Michigan. He was from Pontiac,
Uh,
Michigan. It was in Michigan. It was about 5:15 a.m. in the morning. The police had already pulled somebody over, and they were talking to a motorist for some reason or another. Two cars there, and so this idiot who's already had too much to drink just pulls up and said, "Okay, I think I'm just going to take me a little nap, so I'll just pull up behind this police car on the side of the road and take a nap." And so they come back, see what he wanted, and when they finally woke him up, they could smell the presence of alcohol. Gave him,
wow.
of course, sobriety test. He flunked it as you and I would think he would, and
Uh-huh.
ended up arresting him and taking him to jail. So I guess if you're a crazy crook and you are driving and drinking, you should never drive and drink. But if you ever do, it probably would not be the wisest decision for you to decide to get off the road behind a police car that's
Yeah,
already there with the blue lights flashing. What do you
most
think?
certainly. Most certainly. Definitely not.
Somebody said to me the other day, "How do you get so many of these stories?" I said, "Well, they happen every week.
That's right. Yeah,
Several of them,
we can't make it up.
many
They
of
just
them,
happen.
many of them." And this just happened. This the other week. This guy, idiot, does it. So our crazy crook this week was a guy who decided to drive and drink and decided that he would just pull behind a police officer and go to sleep, and like the police officer wouldn't notice that.
Oh, mercy, mercy, mercy. Well, back to our story. You mentioned earlier about the dog bites. Tell us about
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Russell.
No, Dr. Russell was great. She
Yeah,
came across very, very good
she was.
as a witness for the defense. She had that kind of grandmother look that
Yep,
everybody loves your grandmother.
yep.
But as I said in the podcast, don't let that grandmother look fool you, which Brennan did. on the
Yeah.
way, And and she, she testified, and I thought one of the things, and I've been really having the real challenge with me in the case is the tail light, the tail of the tail lights, and that what we call it, when we
Yep.
gave the little memory hook, the tail of the tail lights. It's always been hard for me to understand, how that tail light got there on the lawn and this sort of thing. And then, I did watch, the prosecution, when they did the blue paint and that kind of lined up with the arm. But
Hmm.
what I haven't really zeroed in on, like I probably should, is the pattern of those cuts. And when you look at the pattern of those cuts, she testified very clearly, having been an expert in dog bites, that they are the pattern of a dog either biting or clawing and this sort of thing. And when you think about it, I mean, the pattern of the cuts, you look at them, they're so they're just like, it's just like almost, right down the straight of it. So if you were scraping it against the tail light, you wouldn't get those kind of cuts that way,
Right.
if
Right.
it swung through it, and yet the tail light wasn't wide enough to cover the whole arm and do all those cuts all at once. So I think, I think she did exceptionally well. And I think, that she came across very believable, that those wounds were not consistent to a vehicle accident, but they were consistent with a dog bite. And I think she did that real well. And I thought one of the ways that I'm sure Brendan would be kicking himself in the head right now, he was had her and during the cross, and he said, "Well, you say your dog bite, this sort of thing. But let me ask you this: if you had heard before, did you hear that Karen Read said, well, she said, I did it, I did it, I did it, did I do it? So she's
Hmm.
admitting it herself that she did, and he said, if you knew that she had admitted that she did it, would you still say that was dog bites? And she said, yes, I would. And she said, let me tell you why. And then she said, now get this, this witness was not only a dog bite expert, she was a professor. She taught medicine.
Right.
Not only that, she was emergency room doctor
Right.
for and on top of that, she was a former police officer.
Right.
So she had all kinds of experience. And she said, yes, she said, because hundreds of times in the emergency room, when people have been involved and somebody has died that they love, they have something called, this grief syndrome, this
Right.
idea of acute, it's called acute grief syndrome. And actually, it's called acute grief reaction. And I've heard that too, so, well, it must be my fault that he died,
Hmm.
and
Yep.
and she was, that she indicated that she could say, because I argued with him that night, or I did this or did that. Not
Right.
necessarily that she hit him, but it's that. So now the defense now can get up in their closing, since this was introduced in trial, and say the reason why she said that's very common. It happens often that they
Right.
have this acute grief syndrome. So I believe Brendan would like to take that one back, don't you?
I do. I really do. Yeah. I
I
think
believe,
so.
and then she said, he said, well, you're not an accident constructionist, are you? And she said, no, no, but I've seen hundreds of automobile accidents,
There we
and
go.
I've seen injuries like that. And then when you take on top of that, the medical examiner who did testify this week, another one that the defense called, who she too said, now she wasn't able to say it was a dog bite, but the defense did get this in. They did get that she could say that it was conclusive to an animal bite. Now,
Right.
everybody knows when you talk about an animal bite, it's going to be a dog bite, right? So
Exactly.
you have two very strong witnesses saying that those injuries on his arm was caused by a dog bite. So I think that was a
Wow.
big win for the defense.
Wow. Well, tell us. I think the audience has been waiting in design in dire
For that
suspense to
bombshell
know who
witness,
the
huh?
bombshell witness is.
Well, it was a lot more of a bomb before all this other bombshell stuff happened this week. But the bombshell witness was basically another police officer, as we all know that after this happened, they went to take the car into evidence, and the Karen's SUV was parked at her father's house.
Uh-huh.
It was in a different jurisdiction. When you go with a different jurisdiction, you always call out of common courtesy to that particular police department's jurisdiction, and usually you have them assist you
Hmm.
because they have authority in there. So this police officer, who was a sergeant, and Barrels was his name, and he actually accompanied the investigators to the place there where her father was to secure that SUV. And he says this time, as he's called to the stand, that he was there. He saw the tail light. He said he did see damage in the tail light that
Hmm.
morning for
Hmm.
about the size of $1. And of course, there's reasons for that. That other people say that maybe it's caused when she hit the vehicle, or maybe when it was hit John O'Keefe. But he said there was damage. But then when Alan Jackson showed him a photo of that same tail light when it got to the Sally Port of the Canton Police Department, he says that is not the shape of the tail light when I
Oh,
saw it back
wow.
there when they secured the vehicle. So here you have a police officer, that's on the same side of the blue wall, and he's
Right.
saying there's no way the tail light looked that way when we first saw it there that morning. So something happened to that tail light between the time that the police secured it and the time they brought it back to the Sally Port, and they took that photo that day. So I mean, he said certainly it wasn't all those pieces that they found on the lawn there that day. So I
Wow.
thought that was just incredible. That
That is incredible.
and it wasn't introduced in the first trial. So here's another. And remember, what Jackson and the defense is going for is reasonable doubt, right? So you
Exactly.
don't have to prove it,
Nope.
but it sure shows some real doubt about this whole investigation.
Wow. Well, tell us about Crash Daddy.
Crash Daddy, boy, he was a big hit the first time, and I think a bigger hit this time.
Yeah. Oh,
I
definitely.
mean, I mean, I agree with you. Like you said earlier, the prosecution's expert witnesses appear to be doing a really good job, coming across really strong. But I got to tell you, both the experts from on the defense, both of them from ARCA, pretty well destroyed the experts of the prosecution. I mean, the prosecution they did a test of the vehicle going 2 to 3 miles per hour.
Hmm.
ARCA did tests going numerous speeds back and forth,
24,
and
29. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and if you remember the Alan Jackson asked the prosecution's expert, why didn't you do any more tests than just 2 to 3 mile per hour? Because we know the vehicle going in reverse was going faster than 2 or 3 mile per hour,
Right.
and that gets back to the BB factor you and I talked about the other week. If that car was going fast, it would have caused some broken bones, some bruises, this sort of thing if it hit him. So until this time next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, stay safe, stay alert. Yep. For the life you save, it could be your very own.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. You can find additional podcasts at charliecrimebuster.com. You can also support our first responders, military, and law enforcement communities at peacemakernetwork.com. Or subscribe to our YouTube channel using tag @CharlieCrimebuster. Even visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/CharlieCrimebuster. Or if you would like to make suggestions for future podcasts, please send your ideas to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us next week for another exciting crime story with Charlie Crimebuster.